title of my presentation is Early Historic Economy in the Ancient Tamilagam. So this has been divided into 8 sections. In the first section, I'll be presenting about the cultural space and time of what we are dealing with here. My focus is on the period between roughly, say, 300 BCE to 300 CE, which is early historic. Now, based on recent dating from the site of Kizhadi and Kodumanal and Porundal, the early historic is pushed back to 500 or 600 BCE. So we will not go into the chronological discussion here. The period before the early historic is known as Iron Age, which is generally placed between 1000 BCE to 500 BCE. And recent dates are available to take this beginning of Iron Age to 2nd millennium BCE. I'm not going into that. So roughly 1000 BCE to 500 BCE is the time period when Iron Age was prevalent in Tamil Nadu and Kerala. The region, what I say here, Tamilagam includes the modern day states of Tamil Nadu and Kerala, lying in the extreme southern part of India. Just to give an idea about the life during Iron Age in the Tamilagam region for the students. And here you can see the Iron Age megalithic burials, which were predominant mode of archaeological remains for the Iron Age. We get a lot of megalithic burials. The problem with these burials are they are datable right from early Iron Age down to the early historic time. Suppose if you take a burial, it could be either 1000 BCE or 500 CE. So this is one of the problems we have as far as chronology is concerned. But we know that in the Iron Age, people were predominantly involved in agro-pastoral activities. Cattle rearing was predominant, and diverse forms of agriculture in some of the areas, and mainly millet cultivation was prevalent. Pottery and ceramic production and metal production was prevalent, as known from the burial goods. We find a lot of iron objects and implements from the megalithic burials. Probably stone bead making also existed because we get a lot of cornelian beads in the burials. From the literature, we know that fishing and hunting gathering took place. So the societies were probably in a chiefdom and community level, what is otherwise called as tribe kind of situation. And these are some of the burial remains there from Adichanallur. We have urn burials as I have shown in this particular image. We have dolmens and umbrella stones of Kerala, menhir, sarcophagus, and then cyst burials. You get all these burial types across South India. And then we have these kind of urn burials also, and a lot of cornelian beads. They are typically found in these megalithic burials. So now we are moving into the end of 1st millennium BC. We are dealing with early historic period, which was characterized by urbanization. What is otherwise known as urbanization within quote. We have evidence for non-kinship based political formation, especially the Moovendar, Chera, Chola and Pandya. And we have evidence for introduction of writing and coin, long distance interaction and exchange. These are some of the features that we see in the early historic period in comparison to the Iron Age. These are the supplementary developments in the early historic. Already I told you agro-pastoralism was there, hunting gathering was there. In addition to that, in the early historic period, we find more evidence for long distance interactions and exchange, introduction of coins and writing, and intensive craft and industrial productions as seen in the early historic settlements. This map is from Professor Rajan. He has explored a lot of sites, and other researchers have also identified several sites. You can see different kinds of burials almost dotted over the entire landscape. But what we are seeing on this map is the combined archaeological sites of Iron Age down to the end of early historic period. One of the problems is we are not able to attain a fine chronological resolution, which means we are not able to identify which megalithic burial is Iron Age, which megalithic burial belongs to the early historic period. This is one of the problems. We have very limited habitation sites excavated in the region. The next map I am showing, this is the Indian Ocean region. When we are trying to understand the history of this particular region in the early historic context, we need to look at the evidence from the entire Indian Ocean region, because we have a lot of evidence for Indian Ocean exchange. We get a lot of materials, both objects as well as inscriptions distributed right from Egypt down to Southeast Asia. Again, if you want to understand history of India, we cannot confine to the modern day boundary of India. So we need to look at the entire Afro-Eurasian area, say starting from Africa, then looking into the connections of Europe and Asia, in order to understand the Indian history in complete. That is how you know that from the Harappan times, Indian region, Indus Valley civilization had intensive interaction with West Asia. Therefore, we need to move beyond the boundaries to understand the interactions and economic relationship right from the early period. So this particular map shows you the study area, that is Tamilagam, Tamil Nadu and Kerala. It shows some of the key excavated sites. You have Kanchipuram here, which was an important center, Basavasamudram port, Arikemedu here. You can follow my cursor, I guess, Kaveri Pumpattinam, Alahankulam, Kurkai, Pattanam in Kerala.
Your video is stopped.
Kodumanal and Urayur. These are the important sites that have been excavated. They have produced a lot of evidence for the activities. These are some of the important coastal ports. We have Arikemedu, Kaveri Pumpattinam. All these sites came up in the early historic period, and these sites have produced evidence for urbanization in terms of brick architecture. I'll be showing some of the images. Research by scholars on the economic history. We have a very good historiographical paper by Sharma and D.N. Jha in 1974, published Economic History of India up to 1200 AD. That is a very good paper. We have Ranabir Chakrabarty's book on trade in early India. These are some of the books. We have work by Warmington, Wheeler on Indo-Roman and Indian Ocean trade. We have, coming to the Tamil Nadu, we have work by Nilakanta Chastri, Chambaka Lakshmi, K.B. Raman. I don't have time to go through all. You can see some of these publications, Airavata Mahadevan, Lionel Casson's translation of Periplus, Himanshu Prabhare's work on trade, Roberta Tomber, Romanis, Rajan Gurukal, and Rajan, they have brought out two important publications. We have excavation reports. In addition, there are Tamil literature-oriented work by Mailai Sini Venkatasamy, Singa Ravelu, N. Subramanian, and Pungundram. They talk about the development. And coming to the sources, we have Tamil literature known as Sangam literature, and we have Greco-Roman texts, Strabo's geography, Periplus, Pliny, and you must be familiar with all these. I'll skip. Coming to the Sangam literature, we have the two important collections, early Sangam corpus, mainly 8 anthologies and 10 long poems, 10 idil, 8 Togai and 10 Pattu. And they present a lot of information to understand the economy of this period. And then we have these Tamil Brahmi inscriptions in isolated hillocks, which are attributed to the Jain monks, with a lot of references to traders, and also some of the inscriptions measure about Nigama. So you get a lot of information from these rock shelters, which are located in the key trade routes and in main junctions, and they reveal lot of about a lot of activities of the merchants and guilds and who were traveling across the landscape. So in addition to that, we also have these kind of ceramic inscriptions on pottery. They also tell a lot about the development of trade and the network. This is from Marangur, this reads Adiyakan, this is from Ramanathapuram. We also get these kind of rings, and we also get to Brahmi on Tamil Brahmi on rings and other materials, and also on coins. Some of the early coins, we have inscriptions like Kuttuvan Kodai, Mak Kodai, and Peruvedi. That kinds of coins also tell about the economic activities. You know about the Pitungarian table, which mentions about the important ports, and also Sri Lanka, and you can see Musiris here, and Tempulum Agasti, and this is one of the oldest map with regarding to the landscape of India, and this is of Roman period. So with these sources, we are able to understand the economic activities. Next, second part of my presentation is on the concept of economics. It is very important when we talk about social history or economic history or political history that we need to have a framework. Without a framework, what I presented so far is the data. We have a lot of data, inscription data, literature, and everything is there. How will you make a meaning of the economic history using this data? That is the challenge of historians, and that is where we need to have some kind of theoretical perspectives. Now, I thought I would present some of the basic definitions from the books and other sources on the economic history. Here we have a definition of economics as, what is economics? That is a question that arises. It deals with the, B.C. Coleman says, it deals with the demand and supply of goods and services, cost of production, levels of income, the distribution of wealth, and the volume and direction of investment, and the structure of overseas trade. This definition is applicable to the contemporary context. Then we have Harold F. Williamson saying, study of wealth generation and wealth utilization. That is what economics is. And NSB Grass says that various ways in which man obtained living. That is what economy is. Economics is seen as a social science that seeks to analyze and describe the production, distribution, and consumption of wealth. That is the definition we get in Encyclopedia Britannica. There is another definition. Many have agreed with Alfred Marshall, a leading 19th century English economist, that economics is a study of mankind in the ordinary business of life. It examines that part of individual and social action which is most closely connected with the attainment and with the use of material requisites of well-being. So the idea of artha, the matter or material, is very beautifully brought out in this definition. This is a modern map, a modern graph or a chart explaining the economic relationship. It is very complicated. So we are dealing here with about the capitalist and modern economy. We are not going to deal with that in an ancient context. What is known as primitive or ancient economy was entirely different. This is where we need to look into economic anthropology. So without understanding economic anthropology, we cannot reconstruct economic history. So I have taken some standard textbook definition here. Actually, ancient economic system were different from modern systems that we have. We have a capitalized economy, market economy, which is highly sophisticated now. We are investing in stock. So it is entirely different. So we need to understand how the economy and economic relationship were in the ancient time. For that, economic anthropology offers a lot of concepts. What is economic anthropology? Economic anthropology studies human behavior in historical and geographical and cultural perspectives. This is very important. How this definition I have taken from Sarah Lyon's account. I have given the source at the bottom. If you read, you will understand the complexity of economic relationship as approached by the economic anthropology. How humans obtain material necessities such as food, clothing, and shelter and sustain their lives. How people produce, exchange, and consume material objects, and the role of immaterial items such as services, labor, and knowledge in securing livelihood. Production and consumption, and meaning and uses of material and immaterial services. These are the things focused by economic anthropology, how they shape human relations. So they are studying this under three factors: production, exchange, and consumption, transforming nature and the raw material into material goods that are essential for human. That is what production is. And then exchange, how these produced goods are distributed among the people, and that is the consumption part. And then we have mode of production, social relation through which human labor is used to transform energy using tools, skills, organization, knowledge. So this idea was elaborated by Eric Wolf based on the ideas of Karl Marx, and who argues work and labor determines everything. You know, we must be familiar with these concepts. And Wolf also divides these production into domestic production, tributary production, and capitalist production. Tributary production is what a primary producer pays tribute. For this we have evidence in the Sangam literature. Capitalism is a private property. That is, many of the scholars, they are trying to study the private property and land ownership in the medieval period. So we don't have such kind of system in the ancient period. So we are talking about capitalism in the very later context. So foraging societies had a collective ownership, and they were owning the collectively owning the primary production sources. There was no social discrimination in the primitive economy, in the ideal primitive communism, and also they had sharing. And in the tributary system, we have ruler and subject. That is very clearly brought out in the Sangam literature. Community was organized based on kinship relation, and tributes were collected, and political control of production. So we have evidence for this kind of tributary level distribution in the Sangam literature. And coming to this exchange, which is very important, Karl Polanyi, who was an important anthropological economic scholar, he has brought out some concepts as reciprocity, redistribution, and market engine, which are important for the exchange relationship. Reciprocity and redistribution, they were based on mutual trust and confidence, and they existed in the early time. So we get evidence for reciprocity in the redistribution in the Sangam literature. Market is something which was advanced, it was self-regulating and disembedded in trust relationship. So market comes into the picture when some kind of exchange happens, when people are not related, when the exchange relations happen among the unrelated people, strangers, we can say. This is where barter also takes place, and also coin, a third medium, comes into picture. We also have scholars like Malinowski, Marcel Mauss, who did ethnographic research to understand this kind of exchange relationship. We have different kind of reciprocity, generalized, balanced, and negative reciprocity. Here, you know, giving gifts, you know, actually creates social linkages. People feel obliged. These are all fundamental economic relationships. We have next level balanced reciprocity, where there is some kind of you know, expectation. So this is explained by the Kula ring of the Treobrand society, where people, you know, exchange these necklaces and bands, and that kind of exchange system existed among certain communities in the late 19th and 20th century. Now, when we come to the Sangam period, or the early historic period, so we have evidence for redistribution of resources, where there is a central political apparatus within court, and which collects these produced goods through tax and tributes, and then it is redistributed among the people. We have probably evidence for market exchange. This happens in the limited scales, probably in the so-called urban centers located along the coastal area. We have evidence for coined money for which metal was used. Coming to the early historic economy, now we are moving into the early historic Tamilagam in South India. We have evidence for primary production, agriculture, pastoralism, hunting and fishing, and gathering, and craft production. So we are actually dealing with the mixed economy in the early historic context. We also have evidence for professionals and service providers and labor service providers, and also ritual service providers like Vedic sacrifices. Some of the Chola kings performed Vedic sacrifices. Vedic sacrifices should also be seen as a kind of economic activities. Then composition of poems. Some of the bards sung poems, and immediately the chief gave a lot of donation. Sometimes it is said that even elephant was offered as a gift for a poet. And we also have people performing burial rituals. We also have people performing, this role of warriors and drummers. So we get a lot of evidence in the literature for the complex economic and social relationship. So we are actually dealing with a complex network and exchange systems. How can we study the network and exchange system? What is a network? Is basically a mode of connection and linkages among various agencies and communities at several sites. So this is where the idea of landscape archaeology can be useful, where we can study the settlements and trade routes and raw material sources and the interactions across the landscape. And the different kinds of networks that existed that can be divided into social, economic, commercial, and political and cultural or ideological networks. And then we are dealing with the various agencies like communities, the producers, traders, guilds, and the consumers actively participating in the economic activities. So now I'll move to the next section of my presentation, wherein I'll present the society as reflected in the Sangam literature. So if you look at the Sangam Tamil literature, it talks about fivefold landscapes: Kurinji, Marudam, Mullai, Neidal. Kurinji is the hilly region, Marudam is the riverine region, Mullai is the forested area, Neidal is the coastal area, Palai is the dry area. Actually, Palai is not an exclusive zone. It is seasonal. When the rainfall occurs, Palai could become Mullai. When there is no rain in the season, it could become Palai. So we have different kinds of people living in these landscapes, and they were undertaking different kinds of economic production. So this poetic concept very beautifully brings out the variation in economic production. So we also get a lot of community groups, occupation-based groups, and we also get evidence for social variation, but there was no clear social hierarchy, but some social distinctions were used, and we find some traces for lower and higher. So we get a lot of literary reference for this, but the society was in a kind of a transformation. We don't get evidence for a very structured society as we find in the late medieval period. Coming to the economic components of this period, we have evidence for agricultural production, pastoralism, hunting, gathering, fishing and salt making, craft production. Under craft production, we have pottery, iron, textile, trade and trade guild evidence is found, evidence for internal exchange, long distance exchange, urban centers and industrial activities. They form the themes behind the economy of this period. Now I will be explaining one by one based on the evidence. Coming to the agriculture, rice production was prevalent in a limited area. We have evidence of rice excavated from the site of Purundal and also Adichanallur. There is evidence for cultivation of rice near the tanks as reflected in the literary reference. So rice cultivation was perhaps limited. So from a rough estimate, it was probably less than 10% of area in Tamil Nadu. And interestingly, some of the poems refer to rice yield of say 1,000 kalam. Kalam was a traditional measurement from one valley of land. One valley is about 6.6 acre. So from this calculation, one valley is divided into 20 ma. From 20 ma, the rice production, the paddy production was 1,000 kalams. And this comes to 50 kalam per ma, which was very good production in the 1980s. From my own experience in Kaveri Valley, rice achieving a 40 kalam per ma was very difficult. So this kind of ideal descriptions are found in the literature, suggesting in some of the regions rice production was very good. Probably the soil was fertile and they were using different kinds of rice variety. Probably we don't know. And with regard to the development of rice cultivation, there are several theories. Some people argue, even mainly Dorian Fuller has argued that rice was introduced into the Tamil Nadu from the Ganga Valley. But we have evidence for wild rice varieties in Kerala. There is an article by Manilal, botanist from Kerala, who has published on various wild rice varieties. So we need to undertake more research on that. And there is an interesting reference to King Adiyaman introducing sugarcane. So that is one of the interesting reference we find in the Sangam literature. And this particular reference from Purananuru 231, I have cited the poem, which is in Tamil. I'll tell you the meaning. Here it talks about zoom or shifting cultivation. So clearly, if you look at the agricultural pattern, there existed different patterns of agriculture. Wet agriculture in very limited area in the riverine tracts, and shifting cultivation in the Kurinji or forested area. That is what this poem says, Eripuna Kuravan Kurayal Anna. So here it compares the burial funeral pyre to the zoom cultivation. Before that, the Kuravan, the people of the hill, they burned the field. That is being compared. So you get different kinds of evidence. And also the poem very beautifully talks about the rice food and rice cooked with meat. We have evidence from the site of Purundal, where we have these kind of rice grains. Coming to the text of Pattinapalai, it has reference to irrigation. It mentions about Karigala converting forested land into cultivable land and digging tank. So this is one important reference. Purananuru 118, poet Kapilar, he mentions about the orientation and the plan of a tank. The tank was in the form of a moon, a form of a Chandran on the 8th day. Like if you look at the bund, if you look at the Google Earth satellite maps, you will see that the tanks of South India, generally they are in the shape of an arch. In the shape of an arch where they trap the rainwater according to the local gradient. So this is being compared to the 8th day's moon by the poet. So that shows very clearly that people were exploiting this rainwater and creating tanks. We have a suggestion that tank irrigation started in the South India from the Iron Age. So clearly people were building these kind of tanks and they were using it for rice cultivation. As I said, there is another reference which talks about this rice cultivation on the eastern side of a tank. If you look at the gradient of Tamil Nadu, most of the rivers of Tamil Nadu, they flow towards the east. So if they build a tank, the water would naturally go to the east. So the rice was cultivated on the eastern side of the tank. That is very specifically brought out in a poem. Cattle and sheep goat rearing was another component that is brought out by various poems, and pastoralism was predominant in the Mullai region, and cattle pastoralism as well as sheep goat pastoralism. We get a lot of sheep goat bones as well as cattle bones from the excavation. This is where another dimension comes about this hero stones. We get a lot of reference to hero stones as well as cattle lifting practices. This was one of the means of distributing resources. Normally, we see this cattle lifting as a kind of activity associated with the hero stone. Actually, cattle lifting as well, and also taking away the sheep and goat was used as a means for distributing the resources. This was adapted in the early historic time. We get a lot of literary reference where the chiefs go and attack the enemies and then recover the cattle and also sometimes sheep goat. Then the opposite group, they come and retrieve the cattle. So this is being spoken in the Tamil literary poem. Similar practice also exists in Africa, where immediately after a famine or groups, they go for this lifting cattle. This was, the cattle lifting should be seen as a means of distributing, means of, acquiring resources. So this was a process, it was a accepted process. Similarly, plunder raids, when we talk about the chiefs, they were actually plundering the properties of the enemies. That is very beautifully brought out in the literary description. So we should not exclude this. This is also part of the economic relations. This is an important hero stone which was identified by Professor Rajan along with Yatish Kumar. This one was found near Madurai. This is a rare hero stone with Brahmi inscription. Kalpedu Thiyan Andavan Kal. It refers to one person called Thiyan Andavan who fought a battle at Kudalur Agol. That means a cattle fight at the place of Kudalur, and he died. So this particular stone was erected in his memory. So like this, there are 3-4 hero stones of early historic period with Tamil or Tamil Brahmi inscriptions. Most of the other hero stone inscriptions are of later period. That is very important. And coming to the craft production, we get a lot of references in the literature for craft production, like pottery making, iron working, copper bronze working, jewelry making, weaving, and carpentry. So these are some of the new kind of industries introduced in the early historic time. So I am presenting the evidence from the literature as well as archaeological context. Here, Purananuru 228 poem very beautifully talks about Kalanchai Ko. And there in Malaipadukadam 474 line, the potter's wheel is described. So you get a lot of references to pottery, pottery urns, and other vessel forms, and the poets in the Sangam literature. One of the poetess was Venni Kuyatiyar. This potter, she was a potter. She also composed a poem. That is another interesting thing. Potters were also composing poem, showing that they have some kind of literary sense and aesthetic sense. The potters had an important status in the society, as revealed by another poem, where the village ritual was initiated by the potter. Probably their role was, taken away by the other priests in the medieval time. So potters had a higher social hierarchy in the early historic society. If you look at pornography, the very name of the potter becomes an abuse. So you can see a lot of social change taking place. We get a lot of ceramic forms. These are from Kodumanal and Adichanallur. We also get beautiful evidence for weaving. A small village with cotton cultivation is described in Purananuru 299. And bow, like even the tools used for making clothes, and tools used for separating cotton from the seeds, and women, especially the gender is also brought out very beautifully. And women in the night, they sit with a small fire and they are cleaning. And women are also described as weaving. They are called as Paruthi Pendir. If you translate it, it will read as cotton women. So women probably were making textiles. We get a lot of reference to textile, and some of the textiles are described as very fine and the threads are invisible. Some of the textiles are like smoke. They are so thin. And also there is a description about blue cloths, Neela Kachai in Kalitogai 72. And red and ochre colored cloths are spoken. And also there are reference to imported cloths, probably Kalingam. Kalingam refers to a type of cloth in Purananuru. Probably these cloths could have come from Orissa. Textile in the fine texture of inner cover of a bamboo. If you see the bamboo tree, inside you will see a thin film-like membrane. So some of the textiles resemble. So the poets were describing the nature of the textiles and other activities. At the site of Pattanam, they found a golden textile thread, and also Arthasastra and Periplus, they all talk about textile produced in Tamil region. We get evidence of textile, spindle holes and textile from the site of Kodumanal. We also have some tanks excavated, brick structures at Urayur and also at Arikemedu and recently at Kidadi. They are attributed to the weaving industry. Probably they were used for dyeing the cloths. We get a lot of reference to iron smelting. Perumbanattupadai 437 refers to Karungai Kollan, the blacksmith with a dark hand, black hand, and there are also references to blacksmiths, bellows of skin, and also anvil, iron lamps. Everything is spoken in the literature. We get the material also in the excavation. Copper bronze working, that is spoken in the Natchinai. We also get these kind of beautiful vessels. What you see here is a beautiful naturalistic scene excavated at the site of Auroville from a megalithic burial by Dr. Ravichandran from Pondicherry. And here you can see the scene in the paddy field where sometime when the buffalo or cattle graze, all around you can see egret or other birds trying to search for insects. So that kind of naturalistic scene has been depicted on top of a lid of a bronze vessel here, excavated from megalithic burial. You also get these kind of Chera coins from the industrial sites, mainly these were from the site of Pattanam, clearly suggesting that the industrial production and metal fabrication took place. They were specialists working on this. We have evidence for jewelry making. We have evidence for this description very beautifully brings out mainly from the literature. We have archaeological material, and we have also descriptions in the literature how these ornaments were made. We have evidence for glass and glass bead making, as well as stone bead making at the site of Arikemedu and Kudikadu, and stone bead ornament making at several sites, gold jewelry from the literature. And the site of Kodumanam is spoken as an important site for ornaments. This particular poem in Paditrupattu is very beautifully explaining how these ornaments were stored at Kodumanam, the site of Kodumanal, and how they were made, how they were using different kind of stones and skin for making an ornament. And this Vanakan as a gold tester occurs in the Brahmi inscription. These are some of the materials excavated from the site of Pattanam, suggest were made extensively. You have evidence for smelting and gold working. What you see here is actually a amphora-like ornament. This is probably a Roman design. We have glass beads and stone beads, cornelian chips from the site of Pattanam, cameo blanks. So clearly that people were producing these kind of material goods, and they were exporting them to the Roman world and other parts to the larger Indian Ocean. And we find these kind of material production evidence only in the coastal sites like Arikemedu, Azhagankulam or Pattanam in Kerala, where we find. And also interestingly, the raw material for this probably came from Gujarat, suggesting that the network was pan-Indian and also Indian Ocean. Goods were moving all across the Indian Ocean. This is where the long distance trade component is evidenced. Roman glass material, iron from the site of Pattanam. And here we have an inscription which reads Perum Patan Kal, which was found at the site of Kuan Lukpat in Thailand. It is datable to 3rd, 4th century. This is very important. Patan probably refers to Pattan, who was a goldsmith. This Kal, you can see this word is very clear. Kal, very Tamil, and Perum Patan. So Perum Patan is like something like Maha great. Peru means big. So he was probably a big gold smith or a gold trader, and he went to the Swarnabhumi, that is probably Thailand and Malaysian area, So this is one important evidence suggesting the movement of people. If you look at Jataka stories, there are a lot of references to Indian moving far away. And we also have evidence for shell bangle working. And we have this kind of evidence coming along the east coast, mainly from the site of Korkai. We have beautiful description in the literature that some of the Brahmins who do not perform Vedic sacrifices, the literature refers to Vela Papan Valarandumita Valai. Valai, Bala means shell, shell bangle, especially Tarbinella pyram, and they were specialists, they were cutting these bangles, and they are found in many archaeological sites, and the women mostly were wearing this kind of bangle. In the early historic time, people did not use glass bangle. Probably glass bangle was introduced in the medieval period. People were wearing this, and the poems describe about women, longing in from the separation of their lovers, who went earning wealth, who went to faraway land. As a result of that, they became thin and the bangles fall. It is a little exaggerated poetic description. We have evidence of this shell bangle production at the site of Adagankulam, excavated by Tamil Nadu State Archaeology Department and Dr. Bhaskar. And we also get a lot of specialized people like chank shell divers, womeners who were salt merchants who were moving along. Mainly here, women folk were also involved in economic production. It is very clear that these people were taking salt from the local area, from the interior area, and there are also beautiful economic concepts related to salt production. I am coming to the settlement patterns. So from my study, I have worked with several sites. I am classifying these archaeological sites into three categories. We have category 1, sites like Papina, but it's a very small site where we dug a trial trench. We found very limited material objects. Mainly we found bones. At this site we found bone. Probably this was a settlement which produced mainly millets, and people had only cattle and sheep, nothing more. They did not involve in any other production. But interestingly, we found 2 rouletted ware. So this clearly suggests that this site was part of the early historic network. This site is about 150 kilometers from Adagankulam, very close to the hill. So where you find two potsherds with Tamil Brahmi inscription, 2 rouletted ware, this suggests the network that existed. Then next category of site that we excavated. So I worked on the settlements of the historical period. I found interesting overlap where we have these medieval temples called Devaram or Padalpetra Salam. Wherever we have these Devaram or Padalpetra Salams, we found interestingly early historic and Iron Age settlements nearby. Nearby the temple, we found evidence of black and red ware. Some of these settlements became nadus, administrative headquarters in the medieval time. So I raised a question, why a particular site has been selected for a temple? For Devaram temples, we have 276 temples which were sung, and also, Divya Desam 108. And many of these temples came up in an old settlement. Why a temple has to come in a particular settlement? Why not in other settlements? So from my research, I found some of the old settlements which had agrarian population became centrally important. And similarly, if you look at the Nadu as a territory administrative formation, why some of the settlements became Nadus, why not others? So we find interestingly an overlap between Nadu settlements and Nagaram settlements and Devaram or Divya Desam, Shaiva or Vaishnava sacred settlements. So clearly people were creating these temples in an important point on the landscape where agrarian population lived. So the Nagarams also came up at such important sites. We excavated 2 sites. One was at Nangur. So I tried to sort of correlate literature, archaeology, inscription, and try to look at the settlement pattern. I call them as category 2 sites where we found some evidence for gold working, crucibles and all that. So they are regional headquarters. And Nangur is another site where we found a lot of materials. And then sites of category 3 as urban centers, like what we have at Kiradi, Pattanam in Kerala, Adagankulam, and Arikamedu, Kaveri Pumpattinam, Urayur, Karur. These were the central nodes on the landscapes, and they emerged as political centers. At these sites, we find a lot of brick architecture and a lot of evidence for long distance trade. So these sites of category 3 functioned as production center, markets, ports, and industrial quarters. So that is how we see the changes of activities in the landscape. We have smaller settlements supplying goods, and then we have intermediary settlements having some kind of production. Then we have big urban settlements which also acted as a political headquarters where the Chera, Chola, Pandyas lived and they controlled. So they were politically controlling the production and the population. Then we have evidence for long distance trade. We have evidence of Tamil Brahmi inscription from the site of Bernike. This photo is from Steve. This site is at the Bernike is on the Red Sea, where we have found rouletted ware and other material. And this is the Tamil Brahmi inscription. This was found at Qusair al-Khadim, Kanan, Sathan, and this is Panay Ori. So these inscriptions clearly tell that people were traveling from southern part of India as far as Egypt. Earlier, I showed you about another inscription from Thailand, and these are some of the Indian pottery found at Bernike. Yes.
Hello, sir. Sorry to interrupt. I think you may take another 10 minutes to conclude this.
Sure.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, right. Sure. We have also evidence of printed cloth. This is probably from Gujarat, found in Egypt. And then, this is from the site of Bernike, where we have an inscription reading Kotra Puman. This was on an amphora. And again, at Bernike, they found 7.5 kilo pepper, which probably went from Kerala. So these are the evidences I already presented. This is another site called Khor Rori, which is known as Sumiram, this is in Oman. They found another name, Nandai Kiran. The name Kiran is very clear. It is clearly Tamil. This was found on amphora. So interestingly, there are 2 inscriptions of Tamil Brahmi found on amphora, probably suggesting the traders who went there, they were fond of Roman wine. We get a lot of Roman amphora in Tamil Nadu in many of these sites. So clearly suggesting that these people were traveling. If you look at the publications of Warmington or Wheeler, that you see a kind of paradigm in which they argue that Indians were not very enterprising lot, and mainly the Romans came and they initiated a kind of long distance relations. So you can see some kind of colonial notions. This was proposed or established in order to justify the colonial rule. You can see that, but when these evidences are looked at, definitely Indians were moving along. We also get Indian rouletted ware at Bernike and Qusair al-Khadim. As far as Wokyo in Southeast Asia and Sembiran, there are materials. I don't have much time. This is Perumbadankal, which I showed you. And also we have evidence for coins. In the early historic time, we have evidence for Panchmar coins, local coins of Cheras and Roman coins. These are some of the Chera coins. And also we have Pandyan coins, Choda coins. I have not presented the detail. The distribution of Roman coins. Beautifully, Sangam literature, Sangam poem talks about the ships of Yavanas coming to the site of Musri with metal or gold and returning with pepper. That is in Akananuru 149 poem, which talks about Yavanar Nankalam, Yavanar Thanda Vinayman Nankalam, Punnodu Vandu Kariyodu Pairam. That means the beautiful ships of the Yavana came beating the foams on the river Periyar with gold and returned with pepper. And this particular map shows you the distribution of Roman coins, again which cannot be taken for granted, because the coins have the curative value. The distribution also can move, but if you see a higher constitution in the Coimbatore region, suggesting the importance of Palkat Gap and this region in the trade activities. Then we have a local exchange relationship. Barter was a predominant mode. We have evidence for a poem in Puram 33 poem, which talks about exchange of venison by a hunter. A pastoral person exchanges curd in a pot, and then the paddy cultivated east of a tank was exchanged. We also get reference to rice being exchanged for fish, rice being exchanged for salt. That kind of references are occurring. But by looking at these economic process, we get to understand the concepts associated, how people were describing wealth. We get reference to the term Noduttal, Valam Kelu. So we talk about a better economy, but we need to get into the mind of the people by understanding the words that they used. Valam Kelu Musri, that is the description for matter, wealth. Aridin Vilupurul, rarely earned wealth. And also the poems talk about the plight of the heroine when the hero leaves in search of wealth. These two poems are very important. Akananuru 149, Puram 343. They bring out the new transformation in economy. These two poems mention that how people were looking at matter and material in this period. So there is one particular lady in Puram 33 whose father is not willing to give his daughter in marriage to a chief, even if you offer the wealth of Musris. There is another poem, Agananuru 149. It talks about the risk in earning the wealth, where the hero says he would not leave his lady love even if you give the very rare wealth. So these two poems are actually idealizing the situation in the perception of the poets that the changing economy, how it affected the people, how some people were moving away from the family in search of wealth. So this concept is also definitely reflecting the cultural attitude of the people. So finally, I am coming to the final part of my presentation. So how should we look at the economic relationship? We have political powers in this area like Chera, Chola, Pandyas, and they were taxing people in some kind of form. They were taxing traders. They were conducting plunder raids. They were attacking enemies, taking goods. This is one way of generating resources. And these chiefs were also involved in, some of the chiefs were involved in plunder and cattle raid, and also the hero stones were erected for them. The ideology of hero stone, in a way, encouraged people to protect as well as involve in such kind of battles and activities. We have descriptions of bards and poets, and some of the panas are described as very poor people. So we have poverty in one area who were mainly supported by the chiefs. These bards and poets will go to the chiefs and sing in praise of them, and they will get some gift. So this is a kind of offering a service. I would call them as professional in addition to the Vedic people, Brahmins, who were performing Vedic sacrifices. When we talk about Vedic, we have reference to Rajasuyam Veta Perinalkili. We have also reference to warriors and drummers. So this is a kind of professional who are involving in economic production. So we have evidence for redistribution of resources to the poets and bards by the chiefs, traders exchanging and having their own guild activities, and they were controlling the production. So basically we have multiple forms of production. In the hills there were hunter-gatherers, there were people doing shifting cultivation, there were cattle pastoralists, there were farmers, there were these kind of people, and they were external traders. That is where I argue we had a different kind of economic relationship. So often it is said that there was no, the Roman coins did not have any currency value. What I am trying to argue, there was some money economy in a very limited sense among the traders, in a very limited confines. When the traders who came from far away, they needed the wealth to be taken in a different form. So these kind of relationship among the traders was not personal. They had no relation. They were stranger. They were generating wealth in the form of gold or other metal currency. So currency existed among them. Local people used barter and other kinds of reciprocity. So we have clear evidence for these kind of relationship. We also have, as I said, this long distance trade being controlled by some of the merchants and merchant guilds, and urban centers and industrial quarters were controlled by some of these traders. So here what we see is a complex set of economic productions and also economic relationship in which all these people, all these agencies like kings, chiefs, and also service providers, people who were doing all kinds of professions, they were involved. So when we are trying to look at the Sangam early historic economy, we should see these factors into perspectives, not directly looking into agriculture, economy, and trade. So the interrelationship, these agencies were very important, and that is reflected both in archaeological material as well as in the literary references. Actually, this is part of a long series of lectures. So what I tried to do was combine all that and present in a nutshell. I hope I explained my points. Thank you.